The sun hung low in the sky as Derek J. Miles cruised down a quiet rural highway, the hum of tires against pavement the only sound in the air. His car, a sleek black Mercedes S-Class, moved effortlessly, its interior filled with soft jazz and late afternoon sunlight. He was returning from a judicial conference in the capital, wearing a dark tailored suit, white shirt crisp, tie loosened just enough to show the day had been long but productive. On the passenger seat sat his leather briefcase, polished shoes resting lightly on the pedal. Ahead, orange cones narrowed the road into a checkpoint manned by two patrol cars and a pair of officers. Derek slowed to a stop, unbothered. These stops were standard. Still, as he lowered his window, a familiar tightness settled in his chest. He'd lived enough life to know that routine was rarely ever routine when it came to men like him. A white police officer approached, mid-30s, buzz cut, mirrored sunglasses. He didn't smile, didn't say hello, just tapped twice on the side of the car with his flashlight like he was knocking on a stranger's door in a bad neighborhood. License and registration, the officer said flatly. Derek offered both, already prepared, already calm. The officer snatched the documents and glanced at them for less than a second, before looking Derek up and down. "You heading somewhere important in a car like this?" he asked, voice laced with sarcasm. "Back to the city," Derek answered evenly. "Work trip." The officer chuckled under his breath. "Work, huh? Lawyer? Something like that." "Uh-huh." Mind stepping out of the vehicle? Derek raised an eyebrow. "Is there a reason, officer?" "Standard protocol," he replied, resting his hand casually on the grip of his holstered weapon. "Or would you prefer I make it official?" Derek said nothing, then slowly unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out, his movement calm, his face unreadable. He knew the script. He'd seen it too many times, lived it too many times. The second officer joined them, younger, also white, watching quietly but saying nothing. The first officer began circling the car slowly, eyes scanning the tires, the trunk, the hood, as if expecting something, anything to justify his suspicion. "You always dress like that?" he asked. "Usually when I'm working." The officer laughed. "Right. Lot of people out here playing dress-up." You'd be surprised Derek didn't reply. He stood still, his hands at his sides, his posture straight. He wasn't going to give them anything, not fear, not anger, not permission to escalate. But deep inside, something stirred. Not fear, not yet. Just the weight of knowing exactly where this was going. The wind rustled through the pine trees lining the highway as Derek stood calmly beside his car, his expression neutral, controlled. The first officer continued circling the vehicle like a hunter sizing up prey, his every movement slow and deliberate, designed to provoke discomfort. He stopped at the trunk and rapped it twice with his knuckles. "You mind popping this open?" the officer asked, though it didn't sound like a question. "I do mind," Derek replied evenly. "There's no probable cause." The officer's face twitched with irritation. "Look, we're just trying to make sure everything checks out. You cooperate, we're done faster." Derek didn't move. "You've got my license, registration, and insurance. I've broken no laws. You've given no reason for this stop. So again, unless you have probable cause, this search isn't happening." The officer walked back toward him, closer now. Too close. "You really think you can tell me how to do my job?" "No," Derek said, voice steady. "I think the Constitution does that." The second officer shifted uneasily. He looked at the name on the license again, squinting slightly but said nothing. The first officer, Brad, straightened his shoulders and stared Derek down. "You've got a mouth on you," he muttered. "On the real confident for someone standing in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by law enforcement." Derek didn't flinch. Confidence isn't the issue here. Misuse of authority as Brad's smirk faltered just slightly. He glanced at his partner, who was now fidgeting with his radio, but still hadn't spoken up. Then he turned back to Derek. "So what is it you do exactly?" he asked, sarcasm thick in his voice. "Motivational speaker? Consultant? Corporate diversity coach?" Derek gave a faint smile. "Something in law." Brad chuckled. "Let me guess, you're a defense attorney." "Makes sense. You've got that slick don't touch me thing going on. Probably got a few clients around here, huh?" "No clients," Derek said simply. Brad crossed his arms. "Then what? Paralegal? Legal assistant?" "I'm a federal judge." The words landed like a rock dropped in still water. The second officer looked up sharply. Brad blinked once, lips parting slightly, but no words came out. Derek didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. He had given them a chance to treat him like a citizen, like a man. Instead, they chose to treat him like a threat. And now the story was shifting. The silence that followed Derek's words hung heavy in the air. The wind seemed to pause. Even the distant sound of passing cars had dimmed, like the world itself was waiting for what would come next. Brad stared at him, jaw slack for a moment before scoffing dismissively. Federal judge? Right, he muttered. And I'm the president. Derek didn't respond. He simply held the officer's gaze, calm, unmoving, with the quiet confidence of someone used to not being believed, and no longer needing to be. Brad glanced again at the license in his hand. Derek J. Miles. His eyes drifted lower. A government seal, an official ID issued by the United States courts. The smirk on his face faded slowly. Behind them, the second officer shifted uncomfortably, stepping back toward the patrol car. He glanced at the license over Brad's shoulder and immediately paled. He leaned in and whispered, Brad, that ID's real. Brad didn't answer. His eyes stayed locked on Derek's, but his posture changed. His shoulders, once puffed with authority, lowered a fraction. His chest didn't swell as much when he breathed. He was starting to feel it, that slow, creeping discomfort of having pushed too far. Derek spoke again, his voice as steady as ever. You had every opportunity to conduct a lawful professional stop, but you didn't. You made assumptions. About my car, about my clothes, about my skin, Brad tried to interrupt. But Derek raised a hand, not aggressively but firmly, with the authority of someone used to order in a courtroom. You mocked me. You belittled me. You crossed lines because you thought you could. Because to you, I looked like someone who couldn't possibly hold power over you. A small group of onlookers had begun gathering at a distance. Drivers pulled off to the shoulder, watching quietly, some filming from afar. A teenager stood near a pickup truck with his phone raised. One woman whispered something to her husband, pointing toward Derek. Brad finally looked around and saw what was happening. The performance he thought he was staging had found an audience, but the script had flipped. Derek took a step forward, not threatening, not loud, but with the unmistakable presence of someone who had nothing to prove and nothing to fear. I didn't stop you today, he said. You stopped me. And now you have to decide whether you walk away from this as an officer who made a mistake or one who refused to own it. Brad swallowed, his throat visibly tight. The power dynamic had changed. Not through anger, not through shouting, but through truth. And now, everyone could feel it. Brad stood frozen, holding the judge's ID as if it had begun to burn in his hand. His face had lost all color. The man he had mocked, harassed, was not just someone important. He was the kind of person who signed legal orders with federal weight, the kind of person whose name appeared on judicial opinions that shaped lives, the kind of person who, with a single phone call, could end careers. The second officer broke the silence first, stepping closer to Brad and speaking low. We need to call it in. Brad didn't move. I mean it, the younger officer continued. He's in the system. Look at the ID number. Look at the watermark. It's real, Brad finally stirred. He looked back at Derek, whose expression remained unchanged. Calm, controlled, but no longer passive. Brad pulled out his radio with trembling hands. Dispatch. This is Unit 12 requesting verification on a judicial ID. Name, Derek J. Miles. Federal credentials. There was static for a moment. Then, a crisp voice crackled back. Copy that, Unit 12. Confirmed. Judge Miles is a sitting U.S. District Court judge. Active status. Advise respectful protocol. Brad slowly lowered the radio. The second officer took a full step back, as if realizing he should never have been there in the first place. Derek didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The air was thick with something heavier than shame. It was realization, not just of rank, but of who they had spoken to, how they had spoken, and what it revealed about them. Brad's eyes darted to the phones still filming in the distance. He cleared his throat, his voice suddenly soft, deferential. Judge Miles, I didn't mean any disrespect. Derek raised an eyebrow slightly. You didn't mean for me to know who you were speaking to, he replied. But the disrespect? That was very much intentional. Brad opened his mouth to say more, but no words came. I gave you no attitude, no resistance. I answered your questions, gave you everything you asked for, and you still tried to humiliate me. The wind picked up again, rustling the trees and the edge of Derek's coat. Brad looked at the ground now, like a schoolboy caught cheating on a test he thought no one would check. The second officer murmured, We shouldn't have. No, Derek said sharply. You shouldn't have. But you did. He stepped forward one last time. Not aggressive, not vindictive, just direct. And now you'll have to answer for it. He turned, walked back toward his car, and paused just before opening the door. I hope you remember this, he said without looking back, because I promise you, everyone else will. Then he got in, closed the door, and waited, letting the silence speak, letting the weight of what had just happened settle in full. Brad stood rooted to the spot, his hand still holding the ID that now felt heavier than his gun. His chest rose and fell in short, uneven breaths. Every ounce of arrogance he'd displayed just minutes ago had drained from him, replaced by panic and something he couldn't hide anymore. Fear. The second officer had retreated several steps away, arms crossed tightly, eyes cast down. He knew they'd crossed a line. He knew the video footage would show everything, the tone, the smirk, the unjustified search. They hadn't just messed with a judge. They'd revealed themselves. Brad took a small, hesitant step toward the car, as if closing the gap might undo what had happened. Judge Miles, he said quietly, through the barely cracked window. Look, I made a mistake. Okay, I didn't recognize you. Derek didn't respond right away. He just looked at him, level, unimpressed, unmoved. You didn't need to recognize me, Derek said finally. You only needed to respect me. Brad's mouth opened and closed. There was no good response to that. No policy excuse. No, I was just doing my job line that could cover the attitude he'd worn from the moment Derek rolled down his window. I never meant for it to go that far, Brad added quickly. I was just trying to follow procedure. No, you weren't, Derek said flatly. You were trying to assert power. You assumed I was beneath you, and when I didn't act intimidated, you pushed harder. The second officer finally looked up. He was listening now. So was everyone else. Drivers parked on the roadside, people still filming, even dispatch, most likely, still listening on the open radio line. Derek opened the car door and stepped out again, slowly, deliberately. You didn't make a mistake because you didn't recognize me, he continued. You made a mistake because you didn't care who I might be. You just saw a black man in a nice car and thought you had someone to push around. He looked Brad square in the face. If I were a mechanic, a teacher, a janitor, a teenager walking home, would I have deserved better? Brad didn't answer. He couldn't. Derek nodded slowly, as if that silence was all the confirmation he needed. This wasn't about me being a judge, he said. This was about how quickly you were ready to humiliate someone who didn't match your idea of who belongs. Brad dropped his gaze to the pavement. Derek continued, voice calm but razor sharp. You may still wear a badge tomorrow, but you'll do it knowing the world saw who you really are when you thought no one important was watching. He turned to the second officer. And you watched it happen. You didn't stop it. That makes you complicit. The younger cop nodded stiffly as if accepting a sentence he knew was just. Derek paused, scanning their faces one last time. He could have raised his voice. He could have made a call. He could have made this a headline before the sunset. But he didn't need to, because nothing he said could be harsher than the truth of what they'd done, what the world now saw. He returned to his car. This time no one stopped him. The sun had dipped lower by now, casting long golden streaks across the pavement, as Derek closed the door of his car and sat in stillness. The engine was off, the windows up, but outside, the silence was louder than any siren. The two officers remained where they were. Brad was pacing now, his movements jerky and uncertain, like a man trying to undo time. The second officer stood near their cruiser, arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin line of regret. A few feet away, the crowd of onlookers had grown. Most were quiet, filming discreetly, others just watching with narrowed eyes. There were no cheers, no chants, just that quiet, simmering sense of something important having just happened, and not yet being over. From his patrol car, the second officer finally made the call. Within minutes, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up. A higher-ranking officer in full uniform stepped out. Lieutenant McAdams, mid-50s, gray at the temples, eyes sharp from decades of public-facing tension. He took one look at Brad, at Derek's car, at the onlookers, and understood the situation before a word was spoken. He walked calmly to Derek's window. Knocked once. Derek lowered it halfway. "Judge Miles," McAdams said quietly. "I'm Lieutenant McAdams. I'm aware of what's happened here. I want to personally apologize on behalf of the department." Derek looked at him, eyes firm, voice measured. "Are you here to offer words or change?" The lieutenant didn't flinch. "Both." Derek stepped out again. The crowd stirred but remained respectful. McAdams turned to the two officers. "I'll speak to you both separately. But hear this first?" He turned slightly, his voice loud enough to carry. "This wasn't a mistake. This was a reflection of how power gets misused when ego and assumption replace judgment. And in front of civilians, cameras, and a federal judge, we failed." Brad didn't say a word. His face had gone from pale to red. His badge suddenly felt very small on his chest. Derek stepped forward, looking directly at the lieutenant. "I'm not filing a complaint," he said, "but I am filing a message. Loud and clear. Your officers weren't out of line because I'm a judge. They were out of line because they thought I was no one." McAdams nodded. "We'll conduct a formal review. Training, supervision, reporting. It will all be addressed." Derek's eyes narrowed slightly. "And what about accountability?" The lieutenant looked at both officers again. "There will be consequences." "That's not a promise. That's protocol." Derek nodded once slowly. "I expect transparency. Not just because I was stopped, but because thousands of others are, every day, without the title, without the platform, and without the camera to protect them." He looked at the small crowd still filming. "That's who this is really for." He turned and got back into his car, this time with no hesitation, no interruption, no tension in the air. As he pulled back onto the road and disappeared into the glow of the setting sun, the checkpoint behind him stood still. Officers, civilians, and silence left in the wake of dignity, reclaiming its place. And for once, the badge had to watch from the sidelines as justice drove away. The sky was fading into dusk as Derek drove down the quiet stretch of road, the world outside his windows bathed in orange and lavender. The jazz station still played softly in the background, but he wasn't listening to the music. His thoughts were louder. He wasn't angry, not anymore. He had long learned how to manage that part, how to carry the weight of daily disrespect without letting it break him. But tonight's encounter had stirred something deeper, a reminder, a warning, a truth he already knew. For every courtroom he commanded, there were still places where he'd be seen as just another black man in a car. Still, he didn't regret how he'd handled it. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't demanded special treatment. He didn't need to. Power wasn't always about how loud you could speak. Sometimes it was how still you could stand while someone else showed the world who they really were. He thought of the teenager with the phone, the silent witnesses across the road, the supervisor who arrived too late but said the words that needed to be said. Maybe the video would circulate, maybe it wouldn't. But those who stood there saw it, heard it, felt it. And Brad? Derek hoped the officer would remember this night. Not out of fear, but out of reflection. Not every lesson needed punishment. Some needed shame. Some needed silence. And some needed time. As the city skyline reappeared in the distance, Derek relaxed his grip on the wheel. He thought about the young law students he mentored, about his nieces and nephews, about the people who didn't have the badge or the robe or the platform. Just their voice, their presence, and the hope that it might be enough. He wasn't naive. One confrontation wouldn't fix a broken culture. But moments mattered. This moment mattered. because change didn't always arrive like a courtroom ruling or a protest march. Sometimes it looked like a man refusing to be rattled, refusing to be erased, refusing to play small just to make others comfortable. Tonight, Derek J. Miles had not been a judge defending his title. He had been a man defending his right to exist, with dignity, without permission. And as the city lights grew brighter ahead of him, he pressed his foot gently on the gas, calm and steady, disappearing into the night like justice on four wheels.